Kenneth, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me again. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Thanks for having me again. As you say, my name is Kenneth Pearce. I'm a philosophy professor. I spent 6 years at Trinity College Dublin, and just this summer I've moved to James Madison University in Virginia, where I'm head of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. I work on history of modern philosophy, the 17th and 18th centuries, and also in analytic philosophy of religion.
Awesome. So the topic today was the logical problem of evil. Could you tell me your position on the logical problem of evil?
Sure. So the logical problem of evil is this goes back to a kind of mid 20th century debate between J.L. Mackie and Alvin Plantinga. Is kind of the modern form of it. And Mackie says there is a logical contradiction between the claim that God exists and the claim that evil exists. And the key point that philosophers use in distinguishing the logical problem of evil from other kinds of arguments for evil is that it's claiming a logical contradiction with the existence of any evil at all. So, like on the Mackie view, if I stub my toe, then God doesn't exist, right? We don't have to go talking about really horrendous things to show that. And Plantinga gives this kind of influential response in two parts. First, he says the kind of principles that Mackie uses to derive the contradiction are principles that neither atheists nor theists should accept. Things like a good thing, one of Mackie's principles is a good thing always tries to eliminate evil as far as it can. Plantinga shows that clearly that principle isn't true in full generality. There are cases where we don't try to eliminate certain evils because they would create even greater evils if we got rid of them, or different things like that. So that's the kind of first part of Plantinga's response. And the second part of Plantinga's response is a detailed account in terms of free will that's supposed to be a story that shows that the existence of God and the existence of evil are compatible because there's this logically consistent story. Now, a lot of philosophers of religion think that Plantinga, even some atheists, think that Plantinga just put an end to the logical problem of evil, and that atheists need to make a different kind of argument, like, say, an evidential argument that says the more evil there is, the less likely that God exists, and there's lots and lots of evil. I don't think that's right. That is, I don't think the logical problem of evil is dead. And the reason is that all this stuff about free will that Plantinga uses is really controversial, and it might not actually be coherent. And so what Plantinga is saying is, well, there's a coherent story where both God exists and evil exists. But the coherence of his story depends on the coherence of certain ideas about free will, which is a pretty controversial claim. And so my view is that kind of whether you should think that Plantinga has shown that God and evil are compatible depends on your views about free will, and different people hold different views. Plantinga's strategy isn't the only possible one. And so I've developed kind of a different strategy that depends on some different controversial assumptions in philosophy of mind. But my overall position is just that there's a lot more thinking to be done here, because you actually need to take a lot of controversial positions in philosophy, in a lot of different areas of philosophy, in order to end up coming down on one side or the other on the compatibility of God and evil.
So what about the more general argument that he makes that there's just some sufficient reason unknown that may make allowing for evil justified? And so if you take like the more general position and not specifically tie it to free will, there aren't as many assumptions or philosophical assumptions that are required to take that position.
Yeah, that's right. So the so-called skeptical theist position that basically says, how should I know what kind of world God would create, right? God is infinitely wise and I'm not very smart. And so God would kind of have good reasons for whatever God did, but why should I expect to know what those reasons are? Certainly, that requires fewer philosophical assumptions, and it's kind of a different strategy, right? A strategy that says we're not in a position to show that God and evil are incompatible because we don't have enough knowledge, both empirical or metaphysical knowledge about how goods and evils are connected, and kind of moral knowledge about what goods and evils there are. Um, I think any theist is going to have to do a bit of that. And it's pretty well motivated, right? To say, obviously, we don't understand everything that God's up to and all of God's reasons. So it's well motivated, and a theist is going to have to do some of it. But I worry that a lot of the people who think that the skeptical theist strategy just totally diffuses the problem of evil and makes it go away, I think they often end up getting much too skeptical. That is, the theist claims that God is good, and they need to actually mean something by that. Maybe not exactly the same thing that we mean when humans are good. Maybe we don't fully understand what we mean. But we need to have enough understanding to give some content to that claim. And we also need to have enough moral knowledge about like what's good or bad to know to like drive our actions in the world and to be able to condemn morally reprehensible actions and praise morally good ones. And so basically, I think in order for skeptical theism to make the problem disappear, it ends up having to be too skeptical to preserve that kind of stuff. So I think it needs to be part of the story, but it just can't be the whole solution, you know.
And what was the approach that you mentioned that you take?
Yeah, so I have a paper that's specifically on the logical problem of evil. So this is just supposed to show, you know, why some people who endorse certain philosophical views should think that the existence of God and the existence of evil is compatible. And it's based on some views in the philosophy of mind that are popular among naturalist philosophers who don't believe in God. So people like Fred Dretsky and Ruth Millikan and Karen Neander hold this view, which in the paper I called it the naturalistic functional teleological theory. Teleosemantics is perhaps the more standard name for it now. So, where this view is coming from is we need to explain how purely natural entities could represent the world in such a way that those representations could be either right or wrong. And so this is what we call intentionality, is the aboutness of thoughts. That when I kind of look at my table, I have a mental state that is somehow about my table. And I can have that thought when the table's not here, or even if the table no longer exists. And so what we're trying to think is kind of from a naturalistic or biological perspective, how would you explain what that relation is between some state of my mind or brain and the table? Um, and Millikan especially relies heavily on biology. So biologists talk all the time about the function of organs or states of an organism. And Millikan thinks we can get kind of a naturalized evolutionary theory of biological function. And then we can say that a state of the brain is about some external object or represents the world as being a certain way if its biological function for the organism is to indicate that state of the world. And this allows for misrepresentation. The correlations don't have to be perfect. So Millikan likes the example of beavers that, you know, bash things with their tail, pound their tails to signal danger to other beavers. And false alarms are really, really common. They do this all the time when there's not actually any danger. But the kind of the function of that behavior is to signal danger, to flee from predators. And it's kind of more beneficial to the organisms to have a lot of false alarms than to not hide when there's actually a predator. Um, and so Millikan thinks that this is how these brain states work and how they get their representational content. Now, there's an issue here. in the distinction between what's called original intentionality and derived intentionality. So one of the standard examples is like the text on your computer screen. It does have content. It means something, but it means something to us and not to the computer. And so if something has a creator, the question is, what would it take for to kind of get that original intentionality to make it mean something to the system or to the creature itself, and not just to the creator who intended it to have that meaning. And that's where Millikan and Dretsky and Neander are thinking it needs to be about the function or the role that it plays for that organism and not for something else. And it needs to develop that function through some kind of process of adaptation, which could be the evolution of the species, or it could be the learning of the individual. And so it needs to be that somehow when the correlation is right, like when the signaling behavior of the beavers happens in the face of actual danger, it benefits the organism. And when it's wrong, it doesn't. And that needs to be the explanation of why the behavior exists, right? So the behavior comes about because when it's properly correlated, it's beneficial. And that's why we say that the purpose or function of the behavior is to signal the presence of danger so that the beavers can hide.
And how does that tie into evil?
Right. So suppose this theory is true, which is something that many atheists hold, but there's no reason that theists couldn't also hold it. It's perfectly compatible with theism to think that creaturely intentionality works in this way. If this theory is true, then you actually can't have representational mental states without evil in the world. Because it has to be that the state develops this correlation by an adaptive process where good things happen when the correlation occurs and bad things happen where it doesn't. And so if you don't have any bad things happening, then you can't actually have the adaptation process that makes the state meaningful for the organism or gives it a function for the organism. And so that's going to mean that if you hold this view in the philosophy of mind, then you're going to think that it is impossible for God to create minds, beings that think about or represent the world, in a world with no evil at all.
Well, you could represent the world and still have good and bad without evil, because I think those two are separate things. So it's, why would you need evil specifically to have that? Because it seems like you could have representations of like video games. Video games have lots of good and bad, but no necessarily evil, and so you can still learn potentially everything you would need to about the world through the proxy of a video game without having any evil.
Good. So it's important here that in the discussions in the philosophy of religion, the word evil is used in an extremely broad way. So it is used to encompass kind of anything that a perfectly good being would, other things being equal, want to prevent. So, like the category of what you're calling bad. So we're not just talking here about like moral evil, like egregiously wicked people. We're talking about if the world is created by an all good and all powerful God, why isn't everything just good all the time? Right. And that's, again, the argument that Mackey was trying to make, is that if the world was created by an all good and all powerful God, everything would just be good all the time. Right. There wouldn't be anything that was even the tiniest bit bad. And so when we're talking about responses to the logical problem of evil, we're talking about, like, is the situation for the theist really that bad, right? As bad as Mackey thought it was, that if kind of anything is not perfect, then we instantly know there's no God. And so this kind of view is saying, well, no, actually, there has to be some kind of distinction between what's good for us and what's bad for us as we go along. or we wouldn't be able to even be minds to have representational states if this kind of teleosemantic theory of representation is correct.
It seems like a super broad definition because I definitely wouldn't go that far. Um, from my understanding, the logical problem of evil all it entails is a single example of evil that God wouldn't create. And then if that single example is logically incompatible with the existence of God, you've disproven God. So why would you go to such extremes to try to show that there'd be no good or no evil whatsoever? That seems like a stretch. Seems like a much stronger burden of proof than what you would need for the logical problem of evil.
That's right. So the original logical problem of evil, as kind of developed by Mackey, was trying to say it's really easy and obvious to prove that God doesn't exist, right? Like anybody can immediately see it. If you've lived in the world for 5 seconds, you've like stubbed your toe or something hasn't gone your way or whatever, and you can see instantly that this isn't the kind of world that an all good God would create. And what Plantinga was trying to show initially is the situation is much more complicated than that, right? And there's more work that the atheist has to do. So in a way, this started out from the atheist philosopher trying to take a very thinking, right, thinking that he had a very easy path. And in responding to the logical problem of evil, all we're really doing at the first stage is showing that the kind of discussion about God and evil is not as simple as that. There's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of examining the types of evil and the magnitude of evil and the possible reasons that God could have and the way that evils might be necessarily connected with goods and that sort of thing.
Sure. So yeah, I definitely agree that it isn't as simple as you stub your toe and that stubbing your toe is incompatible with the existence of God. That definitely seems like a huge stretch. But what about the more simple versions? The ones where it's say there's a particular example you could give, and this example is gratuitously evil, and that would disprove God.
Right. So the argument from gratuitous evils is usually thought of as a different argument from the logical problem of evil. I find the nomenclature confusing. It's been around since this Mackey Plantinga thing, 60 years ago, and now that's how people talk about it. But because the other arguments that we call evidential arguments from evil are also logical, but that's just the way the terminology has shaken out. So the argument from gratuitous evil is usually classified as one of those evidential arguments from evil. It's saying if there is any evil that isn't that a kind of perfectly good and all-powerful being would not be justified in failing to prevent, right? If it's gratuitous in the sense that there's no justification for permitting it, then there's no God. Now that argument has there's kind of two difficult burdens that argument needs to carry, right? One is to show that we kind of know that certain evils are gratuitous, right? And the other is to show that kind of the moral claims that we understand by the goodness of God requires God to have a specific justification for each evil God permits. So I'm inclined to think that we can be pretty confident that some evils seem gratuitous, at least in the sense that they are that it wouldn't be morally justified for God to be kind of permitting this in order to achieve some greater good, right? And that's partly because I have kind of a Kantian view of ethics, and so I think you can't just be using a person's suffering as a means to whatever kind of general goodness of the world. That's not right, and so that seems to me like a relatively strong point of the argument. The question of whether God needs a kind of specific justification every time God doesn't intervene is another issue. Peter Van Inwagen has argued that, for instance, he gives this example. Maybe incarceration is sometimes justified in response to crimes, but it's not the case that every minute of incarceration can be separately justified. So that, like, if you let the person out 1 minute earlier, you wouldn't have adequately punished them. And so there's kind of a general justification, but it doesn't correspond to a justification for every minute. And what Van Inwagen is thinking this shows is that God can be justified in setting the world up in a way that allows for certain classes of evil or certain amounts of evil without necessarily having a specific justification for every individual evil. And then there might also be cases, in my kind of Kantian perspective, it's much about respect for humanity as an end in itself, respect for people's autonomy as insetters. There may actually be cases where it would be wrong for God to interfere with people's autonomy, no matter how bad the evils that result from their decisions are. And so those are the kinds of questions that I'd be asking around the argument from gratuitous evils.
So two questions there. One is that you mentioned the distinction between the logical problem and the evidential problems were about Mackey's presentation. Whereas the way I interpreted it was a logical problem is saying that it's impossible for God to exist if X exists. Here's an example of X or whatever. Whereas the evidential is like it's probably the case that God doesn't exist, as opposed to it being like a disproof of God. So I thought that was the distinction that logical versus evidential was getting at, was the probably God doesn't exist versus the necessarily God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, so there's always a case where you can find different philosophers who use terminology in different ways. But the thing is, you can have if you have an argument that is deductively valid, but the premises are only probable and not certain, then you're going to get to a probable conclusion. And then there are other arguments that aren't written in the deductively valid way, that are written in an inductive way, or even like a Bayesian probabilistic way. And so there are just kind of different ways that you can draw out the distinction. But I think the people who are saying the logical problem is dead, which a lot of people have said, are interpreting it in the kind of narrow Mackey type way that I have in mind. Because these other arguments you're talking about, like the argument from gratuitous evil, those are taken very seriously in the current literature.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because a lot of the theist philosophers I talk to, when I bring up the logical problem of evil, it's usually more a specific example of gratuitous suffering or something that disproves God's existence. But I think they still argue against it. They still say that the logical problem of evil is dead. I'm not. Do you think that's more of like just a like debating tactic? Like when they say that, they are unintentionally referring to only the Mackey version?
That's possible. I mean, if you look at, there's a nice book on the evidential argument from evil, or evidential arguments from evil, edited by Daniel Howard Snyder from the late 90s. And if you look at that, there's kind of a wide variety of views that they're including under that heading. And in particular, it's in that book that a bunch of people like William Alston, I believe, a bunch of top Christian philosophers are saying the logical problem of evil is dead, but we still have to take these evidential arguments really seriously. I mean, one thing they might have in mind is they might think that kind of easy disproofs, it's been shown that there are no easy disproofs of God from the existence of evil. And that might be because deductively valid arguments are always going to rely on premises that are a bit more questionable than the premise that there is any evil at all, right? And so the premises might be merely probable.
Gotcha. So back to my other question, I was thinking that from my perspective, for the more simple version of the problem of evil, all you need is to say that you have some moral knowledge. Because if you have some moral knowledge of what is right and wrong, you mentioned like have enough knowledge to differentiate what we should do in certain cases, then once you have that knowledge, you can build a model of a world that's logically possible, that has a particular example of evil that seems unnecessary. And then you've constructed one of the simpler versions of the logical problem of evil. So if we have moral knowledge of any degree, it seems like that would entail that the logical problem of evil must follow from just having moral knowledge. So just take your approach and to revert it. So if we need moral knowledge, and if we have moral knowledge, then we're going to have examples of things that are evil, and from those examples of things that are evil, we can pick out a particular example that is unnecessary for pretty much everything else in the universe, and that would then be a gratuitous evil that we can do without. Um, so, like for example, the Stephen Hawking example I use. Stephen Hawking can't punch people in the face. He's a quadriplegic. He was a quadriplegic. Therefore, it seems like in order for whatever greater good there is in the universe, Stephen Hawking's ability to punch people in the face is not required for that greater good, whatever it is. And so, if we all had this limitation of being paraplegic or essentially paraplegic, we would all still have the greater good, whatever it is. We don't have to know what it is. Therefore, the ability to punch people in the face is not required for the greater good. And so that would be the logical problem from my perspective.
Yeah, so I think there are two I see two issues with that approach. The first issue is that given the structure of the debate here, it's not enough for the person pushing the argument from evil to have a logically consistent model or something, right? Um, I suppose they could show, if you're making a compatibility claim, a logically consistent model is enough. So if you're trying to show that that kind of one particular evil is compatible with one particular, or one particular good's compatible with the absence of one particular evil, a logically consistent model is enough for that. Um, but what the person who's pursuing the argument from evil needs to show is something like that some actual evils that really exist in our world are actually gratuitous. That is, in the kind of total circumstance, they're not needed for kind of any outweighing good, or they're not justified in any other way. And that involves kind of paying attention to how everything's connected, right? And this is sort of the second issue, which is that the connections with, in terms of the role things are playing in the universe as a whole, may turn out to be much more complicated than could this particular good exist without this particular evil. And that's especially going to be the case if you think like orderliness and regularity and adherence to natural laws are good things. Then there's going to be a lot more limitation in kind of what could be achieved in a regular, orderly way in terms of the relations of goods and evils there.
Wait, why? How so? Because from my perspective, if we can construct a logically possible world that still has all of those things, the orderliness and whatever, that doesn't have the ability for us to punch people in the face, then it seems like that sufficiently proves that there is a possible world God could have created that doesn't have this evil but still has the good, which would then, in because he's perfectly good, require him to instantiate that world as opposed to this one.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I don't think we can construct that, because if that world is going to be orderly and lawful, then we're going to have to be able to show that, like, having all of the good abilities that we have, right, is something that could arise from the laws, could follow in a lawful way without us having this bad ability. And kind of given the actual laws, that seems kind of unlikely. And also whether there are other similar laws, or even totally different laws, that are kind of as simple and elegant as ours, or have whatever other good making features ours have that can achieve that. We actually don't know how to kind of figure out what in detail might follow about what sorts of intelligent and rational beings could exist under alternative laws of the universe. Right, it's very, very difficult for us to see what actually would follow from that.
But couldn't we create like a new law? Say there's a new law that it's impossible to punch people in the face or something. It's a law of physics that if you try to punch people in the face, they become ghosts or whatever. It seems like it's perfectly valid if this law only activates in cases where someone is trying to punch you in the face. It's very limited law, but you could apply it. And if you do, then it seems like we have all of the consistencies, the
Yeah.
scientific uniformity and stuff, and then can't punch people in the face.
Well, so this would have to be, it would have to be some kind of special ad hoc law that is connected up maybe with kind of human intentions or human psychology that would in various ways kind of end up overriding the ordinary biochemical laws of the function of brains and nerves and muscles, right? At some point, kind of
No, we
laws
well,
allow.
so this law specifically is reactionary, and so it affects nothing within the individual doing the action. It affects the other person. So like they become ethereal, or you could do it in a physics sense that the quantum particles are what's it where you can pass through a wall if you just walk into it kind of a thing. So we could use the current laws and say that this is a law that increases the probability of the particles not being able to interact when someone is trying to punch you or something. And so it doesn't really interact or affect biology in any way or
Okay,
limit
so now we're
biology.
bringing in some very complex stuff that doesn't that is concepts that aren't found in fundamental physics, right? And making a special law that quantum tunneling is highly likely to occur when a harmful human action is motivated by malice toward you or something like this. Right. And so we're having concepts about harm and malice, mental states, and so forth that we're kind of changing quantum probabilities in light of. So that seems right, like it's an ad hoc and not a simple and elegant kind of way to have the laws be.
Well, why is that a problem? Because God's potentially infinitely powerful, so we can make any
Oh,
law. And
it's not
also,
that God can't do that, right? That's why I said if simplicity and regularity of laws is a value, right? If that's a good thing about the world, which a lot of people think, but not everybody does, right? Then there's going to be a limit to what kind of evils God can prevent without compromising that value. And that's going to be one of the values that kind of gets balanced off in a lot of these evils.
hmm, I see that one as kind of hard because simplicity, the simplest possible universe is a universe of with just a single black hole, single particle, or whatever. And so obviously there can't be perfect simplicity. That can't be
Right.
the maximum value or whatever. And if whatever level of simplicity is the correct level of simplicity, it seems like there would necessarily be some way to organize the laws. Say you're allowed 120 laws or something. There would be some way to organize those laws that had a different effect. So, like, given our current laws of physics, we can use science to prevent certain evils. Um, like, we can make genetically modified wheat that survives more and feeds more people and don't die. And so, given the current laws and how we can manipulate them, we know we can create better possible worlds. And so, God could have done the same potentially and just modify the laws slightly such that organisms don't die. Like elephants can't get cancer or very rarely get cancer. Lobsters don't die of old age. So we know, given our laws, there are without any significant changes, we could be better, but aren't. So I don't
Yeah.
not see why that criticism would necessarily apply, since we can, even knowing our current laws, make things better.
But see what's going on here. So we now have competing values that are getting balanced off against each other, and it's not clear that there is one unique optimal balancing of them, right? So there's the we want simplicity of laws, simplicity and elegance of laws. We want maybe uh, beauty and diversity of phenomena following from those laws. That's something Leibniz really likes those two. And then we also want to like maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Maybe we also like aesthetic appreciation and moral virtue and so forth. Um, Once you get to thinking that these things kind of somehow get balanced off against each other because, of course, the very simplest universe doesn't have all that other stuff in it. Right. Then we start thinking, well, if we kind of adjusted, if we made this one better, we're making this one worse in any possible way we can conceive. So, in the kind of cases you're thinking, yeah, it might be that our very same laws seem to permit, like, you can have a state of the universe in which our very same laws hold and certain things are better. And it's hard for us to see how what kind of negative counterbalancing there would be to that. Certainly, like some organisms are more resistant to radiation damage to their DNA than others, and then they're less likely to get cancer or whatever. There are these little adjustments that it's really hard to see what the negative would be. In our actual world, the organisms that exist developed into the state they're in by an evolutionary process. Um, there's perhaps some real indeterminism there, and it perhaps could have gone a bit differently in various ways. But there's a question about kind of given this kind of process where actually from this very simple initial state of the universe, the complexity and beauty of biological organisms develop. Um, right. Could things have actually gone in a determinately better way in that sort of process without kind of, balancing off these competing goods in a way that would arguably be unfavorable?
Well, so the whole argument to me seems very ad hoc. Like it seems like it's not hard to imagine a better way the world could be. And I like to do my simplest example is just say, give every conscious agent the option, be a part of this world as God designed it, or go to your own and just ignore. I don't want to do the God stuff. It has all the benefits, but I don't like it very much. Let's choose something else. And that seems to be like a morally better world with just one extra criteria and give people the option of going into it. And that world would seem to be significantly more moral because now if someone was forced to be in this world without their consent, all the evils that happened to them would be immoral because they didn't consent to it. Whereas if they consented to it, it wouldn't be evil for those to happen. And so simply adding this one rule, which seems very simple and must necessarily be possible for a God with souls and the possibility to create minds, etc., would make an infinitely better world, an infinitely less immoral world. And so creating a bunch of criterions that says like simplicity matters or simplicity is morally important or that evolution is morally important or that all these extra things seems rather ad hoc. It seems very unnecessary. And it seems like the ability to make logically better worlds is so simple and so easy to do that trying to make up criterion to say, well, maybe evolution is good, which I think would be the opposite. It seems like you could make equally the opposite case that it was bad that this happened. Millions of people died through evolution, or millions of beings died through evolution and suffered. So it would be one of the things avoided. Seems very strange. Like the argument seems very strange to me that you would apply all these hypothetical goods like simplicity, and therefore this is better than or equivalent to millions of animals dying or millions of people suffering to death or not having the choice to enter the world. It seems like the weight to those is very different. And so my hypothetical of just giving people the choice or eliminating cancer or whatever seems like it must necessarily be a greater good than evolution, allowing
So,
evolution.
so, um, so I think if we just kind of go back and start from the beginning and we think, what are the kinds of characteristics that make a world good? Right. Good overall. I think we're not thinking that only moral goods ever count, right? Or that only maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering counts. I don't think we should think that those are the only things that matter to the goodness of a world. And I think that is not ad hoc. In fact, it's not something that I would think was specific to this discussion about God and the problem of evil. I think people care about kind of aesthetic goods. People kind of artists suffer for the sake of art and think it's worth it. People care about um, kind of other sorts of accomplishments, including knowledge, intellectual accomplishments. People have kind of large scale projects that they think that are not always obviously related to alleviating suffering or achieving happiness that people put value on. And so the question is, if we just think about the kind of broad range of things that are worth caring about, and then we imagine God thinking about creating a world, it's absolutely not that we say, oh, this is the world God would pick. Clearly, it's the best. But it is that when we look at the specific evils in the world, we do see that they are connected with various goods in some complex ways that we can see. And again, with the kind of moderate skeptical theist angle, this does give us reason to suggest, to suspect that there are also connections between goods and evils that we can't see.
That part I don't quite follow, because for me it seems like God could potentially give us the option, say, before we enter this world, here's all the positives, all the negatives. Would you like to enter this world? So, and I could say no. And just adding that one criterion, or doing like a set theory auction and take the entire set of all goods and all evils as they are designed in this world and then make them optional, you've now made them significantly less evil. And because that is a possibility, there's must necessarily be infinitely similar possibilities, infinitely amount of possible ways to make it such that all of the goods and connected evils in this world can be attainable with one addition, one slight addition, or one slight change. And I would also think that entails that you could get them through many different kinds of changes. And so saying that it would be that it's entailed that these goods can only be achieved through this mechanism seems necessarily false. There must be infinitely many ways to achieve all of the goods in this world with slight changes. And so I don't think it could logically follow that you need necessarily to have this set of evils to get these goods. I don't think that can be a logically entailed argument, since I can give like one example, give us the option and then they go away.
So in the first place, we can't prove that the thing you're describing doesn't actually happen, right? That is, people who believe in in like that souls exist prior to becoming incarnate, they usually think, oh, and you, like Plato says, you forget all that stuff in the process of birth or something. Fine. So maybe. I actually don't think I'm that sort of being that kind of thing would be possible for me. That is, for me to have been an intelligent and rational, morally free being prior to my birth, capable of giving informed consent to birth. I don't think it's metaphysically possible for that person who made that decision to be me. I think it follows from the kind of being that I am, that I developed in my mother's womb, and my rational capacities arose gradually in a world with particular sort of laws and particular sort of causal history. Um, I don't think I did or could have existed before that. And I don't think kind of any being that was around to make that decision could have been me.
What about like B theory of time, non-tense theories of time, where like all time exists simultaneously? So the future you does actually exist now, and so the future you could have been asked this question potentially and given an answer independently. So it seems like it's metaphysically possible, given that the way
Um,
we think of time could potentially be tensed or non-tensed.
so it could be. So I'm a big B theory proponent. I actually think that A theory is like sheer nonsense. I have no idea why anybody accepts it. I can't even like write or teach about it because it's just like, because you can't do good philosophy unless you can understand the motivation of the opposing view, and I just don't get the A theory at all. But so B theory, great. The problem is, on the B theory, there's just one history, and so it's not like the future me kind of makes this decision that it doesn't want to be here and then changes the past, right? That doesn't work. What could be the case, and actually Marilyn McCord Adams has argued that in order for God to be justified in permitting certain evils, this must be the case, is that in the end, everyone does look back and agree that the evils of their life were worth it and that they wouldn't trade them for something else. And she thinks that this needs to involve a very particular sort of conception of the afterlife, and that only if universalism is true, everyone ultimately finds themselves in heaven in a blessed condition where they kind of wouldn't trade out the sufferings of their earthly life. Could God possibly be justified? Um, and so that's certainly a coherent view that you could offer here. And at least one excellent recent philosopher thinks that's really true, and that all theists have to endorse it in order to kind of have a coherent position.
Well, from your perspective, where you say the kind of being you are couldn't have done that, wouldn't that entail you don't have a soul? Because if you have a soul, then the kind of being you are would go beyond biological necessity and evolution and those kinds of things. And knowledge retainment would have to go beyond physical brain states, in which case it must be possible to have knowledge retainment in the soul state prior to life and have consciousness prior to life and afterlife, in which case God giving you the knowledge would just be as simple as him snapping his finger, because you have a soul thingy and a soul
Yeah.
memory retention thingy.
So many philosophers, both theists and non-theists today, believe in a thesis called the essentiality of origins. Saul Kripke kind of popularized this. So this is a view that kind of for any object, if it had a different causal origin, it would not have been the same object. Now, if you think as I think this is Catholic orthodoxy, but I'm not Catholic. So if you think that God specially individually creates every soul, then you might be committed to like God create it early and then give it knowledge and let it make a choice and then wipe out the knowledge and yada yada. I definitely reject that view. I don't really like dualisms. I take idealism really seriously, and I think the second choice would be some kind of physicalism about human persons. But whatever the case, I think that I developed by a natural causal process, and that's essential to the kind of being that I am. And I don't think that's incompatible with the idea of my existence continuing into an afterlife. As you say, an omnipotent God would be able to do all kinds of things.
Wait, why? So, because if you develop by a natural process, how does your development through a natural process able also develop some kind of ability to have a afterlife? How did that develop by a natural process?
Oh, it's not that that develops by a natural process necessarily. It's that kind of once an object exists, um, then God can supernaturally preserve it or transport it to another realm or something like that. But an object that didn't come into existence by this process simply wouldn't be me. To refer again to Peter Van Inwagen, he uses this example of, he says, suppose there was some important manuscript of St. Augustine and and it was stored in a monastery and the monastery burned down. And then the monks came later and said, oh, look, the manuscript was miraculously reconstituted by God, right? It burned to ashes, but God restored it. Van Inwagen thinks that claim is metaphysically impossible because it wouldn't be that manuscript if it wasn't written by St. Augustine, right? If God supernaturally created it, God would be making a copy and it wouldn't be the original. In order for it to be the original, it has to be kind of continually preserved from the causal process that starts with St. Augustine writing it.
So I think I see two problems with that. One is that God, being all powerful, could literally just take the past thing and move it to the new location. So it was prior to it being destroyed, he could have just moved it. But I also
Right.
see, like, why couldn't God literally just take all of that past history, as suppose this has to be entailed in some kind of a property related to the thing, and God could just generate that property in the thing when he generates it. So I don't see why. how that is actually a property in an object, because I don't think it is. I think like if
So,
you generate my consciousness in a different location, it's going to be me. I don't see the temporal origin as being like an actual property. And why couldn't God just generate the temporal origin in the object? He's all powerful.
well, it sounds like you're supposing some kind of hexaity is the technical term. Like there's like a property of being me that's some kind of metaphysically primitive property that is kind of intrinsic to the object. It's a really popular view among, again, both theist and atheist philosophers nowadays, though, of course, philosophers never agree on anything, so it's not like this is universal, that actually identity partly depends on the causal history of the object. And so you have to have a continuous causal history. And so there is like, Dean Zimmerman has a theory about the afterlife that maybe, like you said, couldn't God transport it to a later point, right? Especially in the B series, right? Where you need this kind of causal relation from the earlier, where the earlier state kind of leads to the later state. But there's no reason, at least by a divine miracle, that causation couldn't occur across gaps. And so if the kind of later state after the gap is caused by the earlier state, then what we have is a time travel case rather than a creation of a duplicate. But what you need is the kind of causal continuity from the historical origin to the current existence. Otherwise, you're dealing with a copy and not an original.
How would that apply to identity over time? So, like my cells die, get replaced in a brain, and so it seems if the requirement is that the origin of the thing is it's has some relative relation to its identity in some way, and my origin of my consciousness right now is relegated to the neurons that are currently alive in my brain, and their origin was about, I don't know, possibly less than 2 years ago. Then the me that is now can't be the same me as the me that was 2 years ago,
Well,
unless there's some kind of identity shared between those two.
this is part of the motivation actually for having a causal history view rather than, say, an identity of material constituents view, right? Is that the kind of the current cells that you have an appropriate causal relation to the previous ones as they die and are replaced and so on. It's a continuous causal process of preserving your body over time. Um, with homeostasis or whatever. And then the really kind of difficult philosophical puzzle is how to distinguish that kind of causation, sometimes called immanent causation, that's kind of internal to the preservation of an organism over time. How do you distinguish that from actions that are external, right, to the individual thing? But this is part of the motivation, is to say you don't have to have identical material constituents over time. Right, what you have to have is a kind of causal historical continuity.
Why? What is that? How is that a more relevant criterion to establishing the identity of like a consciousness than to say the conscious experience itself or the qualia being some kind of property of you-ness?
Well, the question is whether there's a good reason to think such a property exists, and if so, what it would be. Right. So, like Richard Swinburne seems to think that he can just kind of look into his soul and grasp its hexaity and say, "Here is the me, the property of being me." Um, and just a lot of philosophers are really skeptical that we have any notion of those kinds of hexaities, the property of being this individual object, and think they're quite metaphysically suspicious because it's obviously very different than the like property of being round or something. This kind of property of being this one object. And so if you're thinking that that is really suspicious, then you're wondering what actually is the kind of relation between me now and this kind of 5-year-old who was also called by my name. Um, and so some people, following John Locke, have various kinds of psychological criteria for identity over time, where they're thinking it's kind of related by memory or consciousness and this kind of continuous development of the psychology over the period. And in a way, you can think of this causal historical criterion as a generalization from that allows us to take more things into account. That there's a kind of particular intelligible way in which that 5 year old developed into me in a kind of coherent historical narrative that allows for the recognition of identity over time. And that couldn't be the case, you might think, um, if there was some kind of gap where I didn't actually develop from that child in a continuous way.
I don't understand how the development over time counts as identity, because even if you develop over time doesn't mean you have identity at all. Like a rock developing over time or whatever doesn't mean that there's like some a rock that is itself and not itself when it loses a particle or something.
Well,
Like
we
I don't
might,
understand. Go ahead.
yeah, we might distinguish between what you might call metaphysical identity and what some philosophers call practical identity. Right? These things sometimes get confused. So, um, a rock does have. I mean, perhaps it makes sense to talk about the same rock over time, or perhaps that's just a matter of however we arbitrarily decide to carve up the world, um, depending on what your views are about kind of composition and material objects and whatnot. Um, and the question we're asking here is mainly a question about the kind of metaphysical identity of a person over time. There's a separate, possibly related question about practical identity, which is about the ways that we construct our sense of self and the ways that sense of self gives us reasons for action. Um, and of course, God could create somebody who just already thought of themselves in this way and had a bunch of false memories and so on, and had this whole constructed sense of self identity. But you also might think that our practical identities, if they are to be authentic and not based on false beliefs, also require some kind of historical memory and continuous development over time, right? In order to kind of be the kind of person that I am. I know you think about practical identities being constructed in terms of being this person's son and that person's husband and this university's professor and so on. You could think of yourself in the same ways and act in the same ways without the sort of historical properties that made those things true actually obtaining if you were delusional. But in order for those kind of identities to be authentic and give you genuine reasons for action, you do need the kind of historical claims to be true, I would think.
Why would God generating you with a bunch of memories be any different than evolution generating you with a bunch of memories? Why does the memory having been something generated via evolution make it any more or less true or justifying than being generated by a god? Wouldn't that be the opposite, actually?
Um, it's not about the justification. It's just about whether they really happened. So if we're imagining that God created me 5 minutes ago with a bunch of false memories, well, then the memories are false because the stuff didn't really happen. So the memories purport to be representations of things that have happened in the past. And the question is just whether those things really happened or not.
Mm. So because our minds just generate things to be a representation of reality and they aren't reality itself, couldn't it be said they didn't happen in both cases equally, but because one comes from God, it's more rational, justified because he's infallible, so he's going to give you things,
Yeah,
something
yeah.
completely.
So as a question about epistemology, you might think that if we're created by God, there's better reason to trust our memory. But that wouldn't be the case on the hypothesis that God created me 5 minutes ago, you see. So, because if God created me 5 minutes ago, it's built into the hypothesis that most of my memories are false. Um, so, if God, so the question is, right, whether in order for my practical identity to be authentic and give me genuine reasons for actions, do my memories have to be true? And if so, then God can't make me the kind of person that I am really authentically without having me go through those experiences.
So does this argument only apply if it's required that you have to go through your past experiences to be the self you are right now has to be one that went through all of these past experiences, and if any of them are changed, you're not yourself, and so to be who you are today, it requires all of the past experiences, evolution, et cetera, even the ones you can't remember. And only in such a world would it be justified to allow evils in this way.
Well, again, we want to distinguish the metaphysical identity and the practical identity. So in the metaphysical identity, I have to have the causal origin that I did in order to be me. So someone who came from a different sperm and egg, or who didn't come from sperm and egg at all and was created by divine fiat, wouldn't be me, who had that different causal origin. But I could have had totally different experiences and still been me in the metaphysical sense, right? My practical identity, my kind of sense of myself that gives me reasons for action, um, that requires there are certain sorts of events that I make crucial to that, right? That I take as constituting the sort of person I am and the reasons that I have to act. And if those crucial events were false, then my identity would in some way be like delusional or inauthentic. Um, but I could have ended up with a very different practical identity. I could have chosen another profession or something, right? And then I would still be me in the metaphysical sense, but my kind of sense of who I am and what kind of person I am would be different.
So if you were in the Matrix, would that mean that your sense of identity would be inauthentic? Like if we were actually in the Matrix and you just don't think you are, you just evolved. You think you evolved, but that's false. You have an inauthentic identity.
Well, it depends on what sort of things I take to be crucial to that practical identity, and whether I think it matters. Whether I, whether the table is really made of quarks or if it's a program construct. You know, um, there's a really nice essay by David Chalmers, "The Matrix as Metaphysics." It was actually commissioned by the studio as part of the publicity for the film. Um, but one of the things that Chalmers says is, look, the fact that tables are made out of quantum particles or quantum fields or whatever that have all these weird properties, that's actually really surprising. It's not what we thought tables were at all. If we discovered that tables are actually made out of bits in a computer, that would just be an equally surprising discovery about what sort of things tables are. It wouldn't show that none of our experiences really happened. Now, if it turned out that all the people I thought I was relating to were actually program elements who didn't have real conscious experience like me, or if it turns out that my memories were implanted and weren't real, those sorts of things would make my practical identity somehow delusional or inauthentic, right? I wouldn't really have the reasons I take myself to have. So a lot of my reasons, after all, come from caring for other human beings. And if they're not really other human beings, then I don't actually have those reasons, and I'm deeply deluded.
And so would that apply to anybody who has false memories, any that pertain to any, I don't know, what they consider to be a crucial fact of their life? If they have a false memory about it, then they have this property of having a delusional sense of self.
I mean, to that extent, right? To the extent that they make kind of false memories central to their practical identity, and you can see this in the way people react if they encounter evidence, right? That these things that are central to their lives are not real. This is, I mean, it's the stuff of drama, right? Where somebody finds out that it doesn't even have to be science fiction. Somebody finds out that the person they thought was the love of their life and they married and so forth was only after money and has another secret family and yada 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 and was lying to them the whole time, right? They've kind of, this relationship became central to their practical identity, and it turned out that the relationship was a lie, and that sort of thing does make you feel like you aren't who you thought you are, and that's what makes it so kind of tragic and upsetting.
It seemed to be like an important factor in the view you were presenting that having such a thing occur is bad in the worldview or something. But it seems like that's a fairly common thing, even in this world. So I don't understand why that would be bad. And if it is bad, it seems to already be the case.
So it is bad, and it does sometimes happen. But some of the strategies that people suggest for, like, couldn't God just take away the evils, would require making that kind of stuff happen in a much more large scale systematic way. And so that's what I'm saying is, when we're thinking about, like, could we just, isn't this evil gratuitous? Couldn't we just take it away without any harm? Well, I'm trying to draw attention to other kinds of evils that do sometimes occur, but that would have to occur more often or in a larger, more systematic way in order for these evils to be presented. That's what's going on with the practical identity stuff. With the metaphysical identity stuff, the issue is that just wouldn't be me. So my life for existence couldn't be better in that way, because the person that happened to wouldn't be me if they didn't derive their origin in the way I derive mine.
I had a question about that too. You said you wouldn't be you. So, like, suppose you were a brain in a vat or whatever, and they just put you through simulated experiences to generate the same kinds of memories, or false experiences that, like the Alvin Plantinga evolutionary argument against naturalism, where you could be a frog on a toad, a frog on a like a lily pad, but you have memories that don't correspond to that experience, but they still generate the same memories either way. Um, wouldn't that still be you? Because you, the only thing that's entailed in you-ness is your set of memories or whatever they are. So even if like all of the memories that you don't have anymore that you've lost could all be false, could all have just been generated falsely, and you would still be you in some sense, wouldn't you?
Well, so there could be someone who, metaphysically speaking, was not me, a copy of me, say, if God just made a duplicate of me. That person would have the same sense of their practical identity that I do, right? They would act the same way for what they took to be the same reasons and so on. But they wouldn't be me, they'd be a copy of me, right? What it takes to actually be me in the metaphysical sense is to have the causal origin that I have, to come about in the way that I came about. So if it turns out that I, like, am a lab grown brain in a vat from, neurosurgeons culturing neuron cells in petri dishes and so forth to build it, which is, like, experiments like this are happening right now. They're pretty freaky with these, like, lab grown brains. If it turns out that I'm not someone who was abducted and had their brain took out and put in a vat, but rather a lab grown brain, well, then I'm essentially a lab grown brain. And a real human being produced in the normal biological way couldn't possibly be me. In fact, I'm pretty sure I was produced in the normal biological way, and therefore anyone who is a lab grown brain would not be me.
Yeah, that's a interesting view of the identity, because mine is just whatever previous states created my quality experience, that's me. Whatever my current quality experience is, that is the meanness, and it doesn't make a difference what the origin of it is. If I was generated 5 minutes ago, it'd still be me. I think that's my view. Um, but we do have some questions from the audience. We have been going for about an hour, if you don't
Okay.
mind. Benjamin Thomas Blodgett asked, do you think that the omnigod could only exist if there is a universalist afterlife for all conscious beings?
Um, well, I think you could have an omnigod and not have any conscious beings, in which case that would be, vacuously, the universal generalization would be vacuously true, right? All zero of the conscious beings. Um, I have enough kind of skeptical theism in me to not want to make really confident statements. But I do, like I said, I'm a Kantian, and so I do think God has moral obligations to respect rational beings as ends in themselves. And I think that creates serious constraints, given that there are all of these conscious beings who suffer and so on, that they're, what does it take to respect them as ends in themselves? And that might require an afterlife. It requires an afterlife that somehow respects their autonomy, respects them as ends in themselves. Um, I hope that means some kind of view of ultimate universal reconciliation. but you can imagine cases, and some Christian thinkers have made this kind of argument. You can imagine cases where, as it were, leaving someone outside that reconciliation was in fact an expression of respect for their autonomy.
Gotcha. Uh, Perfect asks, if God could not reconstitute a book without it being a copy, then would not Jesus have been a copy when he resurrected? It's a good question.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because actually they kind of make a big deal in the Gospels about it being the same body, right? That like that the tomb is empty, that the wounds are even still there in the hands and the side, and so actually the biblical writers seem to care a lot about the claim that the same physical body came back to life rather than some kind of ghostly apparition of Jesus visiting the disciples.
Gotcha. Benjamin Thomas Blodgett asked, regardless of the origin of my memories, am I justified in accepting the logical critique of evil against an omni-god?
Um, so I guess part of the point that I was making against those people who think the logical argument from evil is dead is that whether or not the argument works depends on a lot of controversial philosophical assumptions. And so we're going to have to think, what do you think about free will? What do you think about the metaphysics of origins, like we were just talking about? Do you buy the essentiality of origins thesis? What do you think about the metaphysics of mind, the nature of mental states and where they come from? And so you're actually going to have kind of a quite substantial package of philosophical views in order to say the existence of God is or is not compatible with like some things being bad. Yeah.
Gotcha. On the right asks NDEs about NDEs. Does he think that there is evidence of dualism or God from near-death experiences? And what is the best evidence? And what's the France versus Morocco prediction?
um, I I wouldn't say I take near death experiences as the very best um, kind of window into this sort of thing, but I would see some near death experiences as a class of religious experience. And I do think religious experience, the fact that kind of people take themselves to be experiencing God in various ways, is something that should be taken pretty seriously, especially because we don't want to be skeptical, right? We want to, I mean, we want to be the right amount skeptical. You don't just take everything in a totally at face value. But, we start from a position of trust in our senses and our other faculties. And so I do think religious experience is worth taking seriously, and some near-death experiences could be part of that. Like I said, I'm kind of skeptical about dualisms, and I don't think near-death experience does anything to suggest dualism. Just because typically there is a bunch of neuron firing when that stuff is going on, as far as we can tell, and so it's not in any way, as it were, breaking the correlation between mind and brain.
Gotcha. And France versus Morocco.
I think history suggests that France is the strong bet, right? They have a good record, but I haven't followed the current state of things closely enough to know how strong the teams are this year. So.
Isn't France like second to last right now in the runnings in the World Cup? I don't know. I don't follow.
No, we're up. France versus Morocco, I think, is the final. I think France has made it to the final.
Oh, really? Wow.
It's either the final or the semifinal. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't follow sports ball, so. Zemet Gaming asks, what about an evil God? Why does God have to be good? Could he simply not just be an evil and cannot determine if he is good or evil? We
that's
cannot
good.
determine.
So the logical problem from evil and arguments from evil in general, like pretty much all arguments against the existence of God, They're arguments against a particular conception of God, right? Now, they work against a pretty broad family of ways of thinking about God that are pretty popular, right? That is, God is all powerful and perfectly good. That's a popular view about God. And these arguments from evil are trying to show that that conception doesn't work. If you drop one of those assumptions, then virtually all arguments from evil go away. And so, insofar as this is seen as an argument against the existence of God, well, it's not against the existence of that kind of conception of God. It's not an argument against the existence of an evil God or a morally indifferent God. As for why we shouldn't just believe in an evil or morally indifferent God, a lot depends on what your reasons for believing in God in the first place are, and whether you think there are good reasons. I think if you're looking at the world, the hypothesis of indifference, as some philosophers call it, that whatever is the ultimate explanation of everything doesn't care one way or another about human flourishing or human suffering, that's a pretty good hypothesis, empirically speaking, right? It's kind of, the world doesn't look like there's as much suffering as there could possibly be, right? There could be more suffering than there is. But it also looks like there could be less suffering. And so from that kind of empirical perspective, the hypothesis of indifference actually seems to fare pretty well. And so if we're going to believe in a good God, we need to find some reasons for that. And the reasons we find are not going to be in the distribution of suffering and well-being in the world. They might perhaps be in religious experience, or they might perhaps be in some kind of metaphysical argument about what kind of being would be a suitable ultimate explanation.
Gotcha. And the last question is from Benjamin Paget Pearce. If you don't think problem of evil is a good internal critique of the omni-God hypothesis, what do you think is the best internal critique?
So I do think the problem of evil in general, not restricting ourselves to the logical problem in the narrow sense, is a pretty serious problem for theists. And I get frustrated with those pop apologists and occasionally even philosophers who get dismissive about it. I think we have to say, if we're thinking about a traditional conception of God and thinking kind of given that conception, what would we expect to see? As far as we humans understand that hypothesis, we don't expect this, right? Like the evil and suffering in the world. So I don't think we should be dismissive of it as an internal critique. But in terms of what's an even stronger internal critique, my number one recommendation is this short book by William Rowe, Can God Be Free? 2004, I think, is the date. Rowe argues that the concept of a necessarily morally perfect being is incoherent. And the reason it's incoherent is that a being who can't do evil is not praiseworthy for doing good. And so you can't have, so a being who's perfectly good in this way can't have the type of freedom that actually is required for being good. So the very
Could you go back and say that again? So a necessarily existing being is self-contradicting?
A being who is necessarily perfectly good. Because the kind of moral goodness that we have in view requires the possibility of doing evil. Gotcha. Otherwise, you wouldn't be praiseworthy for doing good. And I really like kind of how deeply, even in a short space and in a very accessible style of writing, Rowe goes pretty deeply into a lot of what the best theistic philosophers from history have said about this problem. And I just love how much interesting philosophy you get into about free will and moral responsibility and metaphysics and so on, in kind of looking at this very tricky problem about divine freedom, whether God could create less than the best, and kind of how God could be praiseworthy and also unsurpassably good at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good argument, that if you couldn't not do good, then you're not praiseworthy for doing good because you're just like a rock, you did it necessarily. Got a few more questions. Indo, if there's a reason for God allowing any evil, why should I help anyone suffering? If I don't help and God doesn't help, then it was for a reason.
Yep. That's one of these objections where you start worrying about the skeptical theism going too far, right? Where you're kind of looking at these things and saying God must have a reason for permitting it. Um, but some of these things, when it comes to to kind of individual action, you want to be careful of the fatalist fallacy, or I actually prefer the older name, the lazy sophism. Um, this is this line of reasoning. Suppose you're lying on the couch, watching soccer commentary or whatever it is you do when you're procrastinating, and you're thinking to yourself, "I should really get up and do something useful." And then you think, "Oh, I was reading this philosophy book, and it made this really compelling argument that determinism is true, and so I have no choice about whether I get up off the couch. So I guess I'll just have to wait and see what I do." Um, but right, if you wait and see what you do, you're going to lie on the couch. The thing is, even if determinism is true, you only get up off the couch if you decide to, right? And in the same way, even if God has kind of planned everything out according to the best reasons, it nevertheless must be part of God's plan that certain things come about by means of our actions. Right? And how that relates to our moral responsibility and free will is a really complicated question. But the fact is that kind of it may be that kind of God's plan is to alleviate that suffering by means of my action, right? That may be exactly how God plans to prevent that bad thing from happening. And so we shouldn't kind of overestimate the extent to which these sorts of problems impact on human action and human decision making.
Gotcha. Super chat from Samir Farsain. In a public park, there are walkways, but the grass on the corners is always dead because people cut diagonally. Do you blame the gardener? Good's always the longer way, and we fail for cutting corners. I obviously wouldn't blame the gardener in that case. I'd probably say we should put up a fence, so that would solve the problems. Good's always the longer way. So I think it's an analogy. He's religious, so he's analogizing to God that the reason that there is suffering is because we cut corners or something along those lines.
Right. So, I mean, the Plantinga view, like I said, is all based on free will. And this is one of the very traditional ways for theists to try to explain evil is through human free will. Um, in the paper that I was mentioning, I wasn't saying that free will approach is wrong, right? But only that it relies on controversial assumptions, including assumptions that atheists may reject, and some theists reject. And so I was saying, well, there's an alternative path through these considerations about philosophy of mind. In fact, I think for theists who are trying to deal with, as it were, the whole problem of evil and not some kind of artificially restricted, can we explain why there's any evil at all? I think they need to combine a variety of approaches. And I think something about human free will probably gets in there somehow. Um, but I often lean toward compatibilism about free will, so uh, I'm not sure it gets us off the hook in the way that Plantinga wants it to. But respect for human free will and human autonomy, I think, has to be part of the story here.
Gotcha. A dose of motion. How do you respond to the charge that the Trinity is incoherent?
um, Good. So let's first say we've been talking about arguments about the existence of God. Lots of people believe in the existence of God who are not Trinitarian Christians. So let's just start by saying this is a separate issue. In terms of how I think about this, I think about revealed religion. So I am a Trinitarian Christian, and I think about revealed religion as being rooted in the church's experience of God. And the theology, the doctrinal theology that they're trying to develop, is trying to make sense of that experience of God and the practices around it. And the doctrine of the Trinity in particular is dealing with some particularly thorny puzzles. First, about like a bunch of people who were supposed to be Jewish monotheists had some kind of encounter with this Jesus guy. And then our kind of the earliest non-Christian record of Christians is from Tacitus. And what he says about Christians is that they used to meet early in the morning on the first day of the week and sing hymns to this Jesus guy as if he was some kind of god. And so what happens is that these people who encountered him thought that was a sensible response to their experience, even though they were supposed to be monotheists, right? And then we have this kind of history, not only monotheists, but monotheists who believe in a like immaterial, invisible, transcendent God. And so then we have this kind of tradition of Christian reflection, trying to think about how to make sense of this, and then also subsequently how to make sense of the conception of the Holy Spirit in the church's worship and in the biblical texts. And so in order to charge that the doctrine is incoherent, you'd have to be looking, I think, at a pretty specific form of the doctrine. A lot of the doctrinal statements are too vague to be evaluated for coherence. And so then we run into a question about whether we can, by metaphysical reflection, develop some kind of coherent and intelligible view. I don't have one, like a worked out theory that would explain all of that. But I do think there are some kind of significant elements of doctrine and practice that are leading us into this paradox. And the thing that I think kind of really matters to Christians is the view that God, the greatest of all beings, the highest of all beings, morally perfect, and fully kind of independent, is not an isolated individual, but God in God's self is a loving community. And that kind of then becomes our image of the moral ideal and the way humans are created in God's image, not as isolated individuals, but as loving community. That is at least coherent as a moral vision. And whether we can work out the metaphysics is maybe a later and less important question.
Gotcha. All right. Next question from Benjamin Thomas Blodgett. Do you think that the feeling of religious experience should be considered to be from supernatural or natural causes?
Yeah. So I tend to be resistant to the idea that God intervenes in ways that override or make exceptions to the laws of nature. I think that would tend to suggest that God just didn't get the laws of nature right in the first place. Right? That is, if God has created the universe the way God wants to, then God's not going to have to be fiddling with it in order to get things right. And so I don't think we should be troubled at all by the fact that there are neurological correlates of religious experience. After all, there are neurological correlates of visual experience, right? We can measure the thing that goes on in your brain when you see a table in front of you. And so there's stuff that is going on kind of physically and biologically and so forth when people have these religious experiences. And the question is whether that kind of totality is connected up with God in the right sort of way for us to be able to regard the experience as an authentic encounter with God, in the way that seeing a table is an authentic encounter with a table, or in a roughly similar sort of way.
Gotcha. Samir, thank you for the super chat. you are a pretty smart person, but honestly, this is talking to me. TJump, you are a pretty smart person, but honestly, are you trusting your 3-digit IQ against a suppressed, unlimited IQ of all powerful creator? A lot is in stake, don't you think? Do you ever wonder if you are wrong? So, yes, I constantly wonder if I'm wrong. That's why I'm always evaluating the evidence and seeking new evidence and debate for different people and different perspectives. And so I can only make decisions based off of the most rational information I have at the time. And I don't think positing that someone else might be smarter is a justification for believing that you might be wrong. Do you have any thoughts?
I also constantly wonder if I'm wrong. uh, and I think well, yeah, the fact that lots of very smart people, some of them much smarter than me, disagree with me, is a good reason for thinking I might be wrong, but it's not a good reason for instantly changing my mind. And it doesn't mean that I kind of have to be neutral and can't have a side on the question. We're all doing the best we can to try to believe reasonably, and we should certainly take into account um, the testimony that we have for very intelligent people. The fact that God is infinitely smarter than all of us is maybe not much help, because one of the things that we're trying to figure out is whether God has told us anything, whether we have any reason to believe that God knows this or the other, or even exists. And so the fact that God is infinitely smarter than all of us maybe isn't, even if it is a fact, which I think it is maybe not helping us figure out what to believe.
Gotcha. And last question from Dose of Motion: how do you respond to the charge that? Oh no, that's the incoherence of the Trinity one that we asked before. So I forgot to delete that one. Birdie asks, has Kenneth read all the books behind him?
um, I think so. Well, I wrote those ones, so so wrote or edited the ones on that shelf. Um, yes, I think all the books behind me are books I've read.
Cool. That is it for the questions. Really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter at Kenneth L. Pearce, and you can find kind of all of my published papers and stuff at writings.kennypearce.net.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was great talking to you as always, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.